Before Microsoft, Apple, and Google, there was one tech company that ruled the world: IBM. And during IBM's golden age, in the 1960s and 70s, it made about 70% of all computer sales worldwide, reaching $50 billion in revenue and nearly 400,000 employees. But behind all that success lurks a story of incredible evil, one that IBM refuses to acknowledge, filled with racism, dangerous healthcare treatments, and even assisting in the genocide of 6 million innocent people. This is the incredibly dark but true story of three men: an inventor, a ruthless business mogul, and his hapless son, who together created the first multi-billion-dollar tech empire, one that transformed a noble idea into an architect of death, all before collapsing from the inside out. This is the horrifying true story of IBM and the brutal crimes they will never admit. Many of the shocking details in this video were fact-checked using the incredible book IBM and the Holocaust by best-selling author Edwin Black. Link in the description. It was 1879, and an excited young man named Herman Hollerith was ready to change the world. Only problem was, he was stuck in one of the most forgettable places on Earth, a dull government office in the middle of Washington, D.C. Herman's hard work and intelligence had led him through an engineering degree at the prestigious Columbia University in New York City at just 19 years old. But after graduating, he found that he wasn't suited for academic life. Instead, he wanted to invent machines that could help people and actually fix problems. So he traveled 200 miles south to the US Capitol, where he had been offered a job at the United States Census Office, a government department that focused on collecting all of the routine information on American citizens that would be able to help politicians make policies and investments for each city around the country. When Herman first walked into his new office, he was feeling grateful that he was able to earn such a great job at his young age, with the Census Department being a highly respected place to work just 20 minutes away from the President and the White House. But Herman Hollerith was in for a rude awakening as he started to get familiar with the process of how all these census documents were being handled and recorded, quickly realizing just how much of a mess his new data collection job would be. Because the census recorded up to 24 potential data points for each of its 50 million Americans who submitted responses. And most of the documents were written by hand and then sorted manually. This process was incredibly time-consuming and expensive. After seeing all of this, it wasn't long before Herman started crafting his own ideas on how to improve things. And after a few initial failed attempts, a genius idea struck him over dinner one night. He wondered out loud, what if it would be possible to automate this incredibly long and repetitive process? Herman didn't know it at the time, but this innocent idea to make his job easier would be twisted to execute some of the most evil acts in all of world history just 50 years later. Because just a 2-hour drive from where Hollerith was born in upstate New York, another young boy was growing up at the same time, and he would turn Herman's practical invention into one of the most powerful companies in the world. This boy was Thomas Watson, and Thomas was born on a small farm in the middle of nowhere in 1874, where his father sold lumber to local companies in the area. But due to a set of extremely unlucky circumstances, Thomas's family could never make their business profitable, forcing them to struggle just to put food on their table. During one year, a flood had wiped out the farm's total lumber supply, and only a few years later, a fire had completely destroyed their entire family home. The pain of his penniless childhood created a desperation in Thomas to make something of himself. That way, he could break out of poverty. And it was this obsession that would turn into a horrifying character flaw many years later that would haunt Thomas throughout his business career, blinding his sense of morals to the horrifying decisions he would later make while leading his tech empire. But in the meantime, no one believed Thomas would amount to anything. And for a while, his critics were right. After earning his certificate as a school teacher, Thomas Watson quit his very first day on the job. Without any clear direction for his life, he eventually found work in a tiny town called Painted Post. bouncing around random jobs, first at a general store, then at a hardware shop, and finally as a salesman selling horse and buggies to homeowners. But Thomas started to realize maybe these jobs weren't so random after all. They had all had one simple thing in common: sales. And it made him feel deep in his bones that he was destined for big things. But for now, Thomas was a small fish in an even smaller pond. But while all of this was going on 5 hours south of Thomas, Herman Hollerith was sitting in his Washington, D.C. office, rushing to develop his automated counting machine for the next census. After years of tinkering, he finally came up with a solution to fix this wasteful manual process that had plagued the Census Department for decades. His strategy was simple. He would punch holes in the paper cards, with each hole representing specific pieces of information. In his case, different answers to questions on a census form. But the real magic took place once these cards were placed inside his machine. Because after pressing a simple button, the hundreds of rows of metal pins hidden within the device would press downward onto the paper card. And if a pin hit the paper, then nothing would happen. But if a pin found a hole instead, it would create an electric current. And this electric current would turn a dial every time a data point needed to be recorded, like age or marital status. With this very early version of the modern computer, key data for entire populations could be sorted into groups based on any characteristic like gender, age, or race. Herman named it after himself, calling it the Hollerith machine. And the timing could not have been any better for him either, because Herman was given the contract to the entire 1880 census, earning him a staggering $750,000, making him rich overnight. With this cash influx, Herman created a new entity named Tabulating Machine Company and decided to take his innovations all over the world. But Herman had a problem. He was a brilliant engineer without any business or political experience. And this inexperience, combined with his growing ego, started to put Herman's promising business at risk. He was constantly paranoid that people were trying to steal from him, all while making terrible investments with his profits and even getting into fights with his key clients. And these increasing personal feuds ended up driving a wedge between him and his most important customer, the US Census Group, who decided to fire Herman and replace him with a new team of engineers that would create an even more advanced version of Hollerith's machine. And this gut punch from the Census Department firing him made everything very clear to Herman. His tabulating machine company was in serious trouble. Hollerith didn't know it at the time, but this critical mistake, losing his most important client, would go on to kick off a chain reaction of events that would turn his little census company into the biggest tech giant on Earth. He only needed a man that he hadn't met yet to take the reins and save it. While Herman Hollerith was fighting for the survival of his business, hundreds of miles away, Thomas J. Watson was close to discovering a strategy to finally escape the poverty that had trapped his father. But it wouldn't come easy. First, he would suffer from a string of failures, including an embarrassing situation where Thomas had all of his belongings stolen after a night of drinking. Ultimately, these mistakes forced him to file for bankruptcy, where he took up a humbling job at a local butcher shop. Feeling cursed like his father, Thomas was just about to lose all hope when he made a routine stop in at a local store that would change his life forever. Because when visiting a nearby branch of the National Cash Register Company, or NCR for short, Thomas had a true light bulb moment. He realized that NCR's cash registers were exploding in popularity all around the country, and that this company could be the opportunity he'd been waiting for his entire life. So Thomas decided he wouldn't let this moment slip through his fingers, begging the manager for a sales job, calling him every day until the company finally said yes. But once Thomas got started, he was a complete natural. It was clear he was born to be a salesman, swiftly reaping the rewards for his hard work and dedication. In just 4 years' time, NCR's president, John Henry Patterson, put Thomas in charge of his very own branch. But this new branch also had a shady hidden agenda, because Thomas's boss, John Henry, explained that NCR had a problem. Their products were too good, and their cash registers were such high quality that secondhand stores were simply repairing them and reselling them to customers. which stopped clients from needing to buy new NCR equipment. Thomas's job was to set up a second-hand repair shop and ruthlessly undercut prices in the area, sabotaging their competitors' reputation while forcing them to sell their businesses to NCR or go bankrupt. It was a dirty move and very illegal, but Watson didn't care. He would do anything to avoid the doomed fate of his father. And despite his clear lack of ethics, all of these dirty deeds paid off massively for Thomas. After 5 years at NCR, he had become the CEO's right-hand man, moving around the country to set up these predatory repair and resale shops. And over the next decade, Thomas lived the high life while working his executive job at NCR, joining elite society, country clubs, and eating at expensive restaurants every night. It was a world away from the tiny farm and poverty that he had grown up in. But then, on February 22nd, 1912, his dream life came crashing down all at once. Thomas woke up to read the newspaper and found the shocking headline, "NCR men indicted by a federal grand jury," plastered across the front page. Thomas's eyes widened in horror as he even found his own name in the article, accusing him of bribery, predatory pricing, and intimidating competitors, which meant he was facing up to 3 years in prison if found guilty. But from Thomas's point of view, he didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. So while he was released on bail, as NCR fought the charges, Thomas Watson refused to acknowledge these mistakes. And it was this stubborn arrogance that would go on to destroy his reputation within NCR. You see, even after being found guilty and sentenced to 1 year in prison, NCR's legal team had been working behind the scenes to reach an agreement with the government to get all charges dropped against their executive team. But only if each of the leaders being accused in the lawsuit would sign a document admitting responsibility for their illegal actions. The entire NCR team agreed to these terms instantly, except for one man, Thomas J. Watson. Because despite being at the center of all of the crimes committed in NCR's case, Thomas was the only executive who wouldn't admit any guilt, refusing to budge an inch, even if it meant that he and all of his work friends could avoid a 1-year prison sentence. This refusal to compromise with the US government created a bitter hatred between him and his former mentor, John Henry Patterson, while also alienating Watson from most of the other leaders at NCR. And even though the case was eventually dropped against Thomas and the other NCR leaders, the damage was already done, costing him everything at his beloved company. Because shortly after the lawsuit ended, Thomas was fired from NCR without any warning. But instead of jumping into another high-paying corporate job, Thomas was determined to build his own destiny. But by then, Herman's lawsuit against the US government had been dragging on for years. And even though they reached a settlement, the stress of that case took a toll on his well-being, leading to a rapid decline in his health. Herman's doctor recommended that he retire as soon as possible. So in 1911, he agreed to sell his company to Charles Randlett Flint, a notorious rubber tycoon who quickly combined it with 3 other companies. Flint wanted a ruthless businessman to lead his new corporation, looking for someone completely the opposite of Herman Hollerith, a savvy, cold-blooded leader who was obsessed with winning at any cost. And he found that man in Thomas J. Watson. Shortly after Watson arrived at his new company, he realized that he had taken over a complete disaster that was millions of dollars in debt. So he started fixing problems one at a time. First, focusing on the part of the business that he knew best, the company's sales force. Watson knew that businesses everywhere were going to want to get their hands on the Hollerith punch card system. But he just needed to figure out the right strategy to help his sales team so it could really take off. So he started motivating them with annual conventions, events, and giving generous bonuses to the people who were generating the most revenue, while at the same time slowly removing the drinking and partying culture that was normal course of action in most businesses for that time. He wanted his team alert, focused, and most importantly, loyal to him, his company, and his vision. And these leadership strategies worked very quickly, doubling their annual revenue in his first few years as a general manager. Shortly after, Thomas Watson was named president of CTR. And over the course of the next decade, throughout the turbulence of World War I, the Spanish flu, and the stock market crash of 1921, Watson continued applying the lessons that he learned at NCR in order to build his new business dynasty. Advancing technology forward with breakthroughs like the electronic key punch system and more efficient punch cards that could hold double the data of previous versions. But beyond the technology advancements, Thomas Watson wanted to rebrand the company with a new name. He wanted a colossal trademark that would make a statement. So when 3 of the company's Canadian subsidiaries were brought into the fold, Watson took this opportunity to unveil his new name, International Business Machines, or IBM for short. Many shareholders didn't approve, but Watson didn't give a damn. It was his mark of authority. So in 1924, the company name was officially changed. Watson's ego was growing with every success. He referred to his employees as the IBM family, with himself as the patriarch, creating a cult-like environment at his company with him at the center of it all. So much so that songs were written for the employees to chant, including an IBM anthem that ended with the now haunting words, "Hail to the IBM." Thomas Watson was a relentless perfectionist, extremely demanding and rarely satisfied. His obsession with the company became infamous, with appearances in newspapers becoming common the more IBM grew. Watson knew that his reputation would be just as important as his company's brand, so he carefully crafted his public image. He built a library for his employees and gave them free access, also creating executive training programs and later eventually opening up an IBM schoolhouse. And inside the company, he slowly moved IBM away from all other parts of the business outside of tabulating machines and their punch cards, placing all the company's focuses and resource on a single product, with demand for these devices seemingly endless. So much so that even the Great Depression of the 1930s couldn't stop IBM's meteoric rise. Watson had stumbled into a goldmine of data at the time when its value was only just being realized. And the impact of these trends quickly showed up on IBM's accounting books, with revenue jumping by 30% within a couple of years. And thanks to a savvy deal that Watson negotiated when joining the company, he was now getting 5% of all company profits, earning him over $365,000 per year, almost $7 million in today's money, making him the highest paid business leader in the country, which gave him the nickname the $1,000 a day man. And if you want to end up as a $1,000 a day man or woman as well, then make sure to subscribe, and I guarantee you'll get as rich as Thomas Watson, or at least get your own, cool nickname? IBM continued to expand globally, creating branch offices in emerging economies like Brazil when they supplied the Brazilian government with tabulating machines and punch cards even after a bloody revolution. This became the blueprint for international expansion at IBM. Watson created a subsidiary within a foreign country and then partnered with their local government, and his global business empire was sprawling across the world. However, one country stood out from the rest, being IBM's most profitable foreign region, accounting for over 50% of all of IBM's overseas revenue. But what's even more shocking is all this growth was coming from a war-torn country recently suffering from a complete economic collapse. And at the center of it all, a man who was making waves for his terrifying ideas and fiery speeches that were starting to shake the world. Watson had already learned that recession would be good for IBM's business, but now he would discover that war would explode his profits to heights he could never imagine. But in order to get there, he would need to make a deal with the devil. When German soldiers in Berlin were ordered to lock down the city during World War I, they were sent to secure a building from a company called Diomach, and inside that building, they found machines belonging to an American company, IBM. Knowing just how valuable these machines were, the Germans didn't steal or damage any of them. And so when Thomas Watson heard about this back in New York, He was impressed. And after World War I died down, Watson wanted to invest in this German company that was using his machines, which was perfect timing for Dielmach as well, since they were already paying heavy royalties and service fees in order to use IBM's punch card machines. But when the German economy took a nosedive in the early 1920s after World War I, Dielmach still owed $104,000 to IBM in royalty payments alone, just under $2 million in today's value. So instead of chasing this unpayable debt, Thomas Watson flew to Germany himself to make a deal with Dielmach's owner, a man named Willy Haidinger. And Watson's offer was simple. IBM would take 51% ownership of Dielmach, and the debt would be forgotten. Haidinger wasn't happy about letting this much of his company go, but he had no choice. It was either that or bankruptcy. But Watson didn't stop there. Instead, he brutally twisted the knife during negotiations with Haidinger as Dielmach's value continued to drop even further during deal discussions due to Germany's rapidly declining economy. And now, Watson wanted 90% of his company. But there was no way out for Haidinger, and after a reluctant handshake, Dielmach became the German subsidiary for IBM, which proved to be a brilliant deal for Thomas Watson, because Germany's new leader wanted to gather more data on his citizens than anyone had in human history. He was a dark force who had slowly been rising in German political circles for years, an Austrian-born man named Adolf Hitler.
Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab, wenn ja! Dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
And by 1933, Adolf Hitler had slithered his way into becoming the Chancellor of Germany based on selling the German people the dream of becoming once again a great nation while blaming a small subset of their total population for all of their problems. But he wouldn't stop there. 3 months after he became Chancellor, Hitler gave Dielmach its first assignment. He wanted a census to be taken, and he was willing to pay 1.35 million Reichsmarks in order to get it done fast. And 75% of that payment from the Nazis was going overseas back to IBM. It was a test case to prove just how efficient Dielmach and IBM's machines could really be. So in May 1933, 5 months after Hitler had become Chancellor, 500,000 Nazi volunteers walked door to door in Germany's biggest state, gathering the answers to 60 questions for each and every one of its 40 million citizens. With all of these forms being sent back to Berlin, each one carrying critical information like age, gender, language, family, race, and most importantly, religion. More than enough information needed to identify every single citizen through IBM's machines, with the cards of its Jewish citizens being put into a separate pile to be used later. And with that, the first stage of Hitler's cruel plan was already in motion. Hitler was impressed, and so he handed the contract over to Dielmach, which now made them essential to the Nazis. While on the other side of the world, Thomas Watson monitored and managed the developments closely. And later that year, he decided to travel to Berlin to inspect Dielmach himself. But he was also there for another reason, to make a secret deal. Because during that trip, Watson gave Dielmach the right to manufacture his punch card machines for other IBM partners, with Dielmach now acting as his champion for the rest of Europe. And soon after Watson left back for the US, a new Dielmach plant quickly opened up in Berlin. At the ceremony, Dielmach's chief, Willy Haidinger, told the media that the company was honored to help give Hitler the information that he needed, because Haidinger was a proud Nazi, and he was excited that his company, Dielmach, was going to be part of the Nazi mission to purify his race. Back in New York, Thomas Watson read a translation of Heidinger's speech, and even with a rough translation, the message was crystal clear. The leader of his most treasured international branch supported Adolf Hitler's disturbing plan to exterminate the Jewish people that the Nazis viewed as a sickness plaguing the German population. So despite protests all over the US calling for American companies to stop partnering with the Nazi Party, Watson's warped sense of morals didn't see a problem with Heidinger's dangerous message, going as far to even send back a congratulations letter to Haidinger on the launch of the new plant. And with that action, Thomas Watson had made a deal with the devil. He was now working with Adolf Hitler, supplying the machinery necessary to identify and track the entire German population. And it was painfully clear what Hitler wanted to do with this information: hunt down innocent Jews. Watson saw this coming and was ready to profit from the horror caused by Hitler. The Diomach's lucrative Nazi contracts were creating problems for IBM because the American people were starting to strongly criticize the Nazis for their evil actions. So behind the scenes, Thomas Watson worked tirelessly on a diabolical plan to ensure no trace of IBM's deals with the devil ever saw the light of day, and in doing so, created a complex web of contracts and shell companies that turned IBM's work with the Nazis into a shape-shifting ghost, leaving critics and investigators chasing shadows for decades. Shortly after Hitler took power, it wasn't long before his frightening plan started to take shape. After calling for a national revolution, the Nazis unleashed a wave of violence across the country, forcing the German parliament to make Adolf Hitler their dictator, giving him complete control over all of Germany. Nazi loyalists started addressing Hitler as the Führer, translating into the undisputed leader. Ironically enough, this was a similar term to what IBM employees used for Thomas Watson. And now, Hitler had the power to make his terrifying ideas into a real-life nightmare for Germany's Jewish population, with every step being carefully planned. First, Hitler banned any Jewish person from marrying or even dating anyone of German blood, something the Nazis called race defilement. Then, the Nazi Party doubled down on their original census surveys in order to carry out what the Nazi scientists called race hygiene. And as this fake science evolved, it divided people into categories based on where their ancestors came from, going back to parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparent generations as far back as 1750. And thanks to this additional data provided by Diomach, Hitler's secret police force, the Gestapo, now had a complete list of Jewish targets narrowed down to specific cities, neighborhoods, and even housing blocks where they lived, which made it easy for them to hunt down each one of their Jewish citizens one by one. Tens of thousands of innocent people were quickly arrested, imprisoned, and sent away to concentration camps to work as slaves. But back in the United States, Thomas Watson couldn't be happier with how things were going with the Nazis, going as far to tell people in his circle that the world should be sympathetic of Hitler's goals. For Watson, the Nazi obsession with statistics only meant one thing to him: mountains of cash for IBM. And this connection to Hitler's Germany was getting stronger by the day, with the Nazis even becoming IBM's most valuable client at that time, which meant Thomas J. Watson was making millions for himself, loaning his machines to the most evil government in the world. And IBM brought out the red carpet for their best customer, even custom building their equipment for every different type of report that the Nazis requested, with each new survey requiring customized punch cards that could only be purchased from IBM via Diomach and configured by IBM certified engineers, meaning that some of IBM's employees understood exactly what the Nazis were planning to use their machines for, because they needed to ensure that all of the data would fit on a single card for each Nazi task. These trademark punch cards were the only ones that worked with IBM machines, dating all the way back to when its inventor, Herman Hollerith, was paranoid that his technology would be stolen. And it was these types of shady business tactics that Watson used to lock in customers around the world and then squeeze them for every dollar of profit that they possibly could. But for the Nazis, the money spent didn't matter to their leaders, as long as their brutal plan could be carried out. So shortly after Hitler came to power, Watson invested $1 million into Diomach to boost its production for its most important client. And within a few years, IBM's German subsidiary was bringing in $4 million in revenue every single year. It had truly become a money-making machine for Thomas Watson. But getting these juicy profits out of Germany and back into IBM's bank accounts in the United States wasn't so easy, because after Hitler came to power, Nazi Germany had become a tightly controlled economy. But IBM dodged Nazi rules that trapped foreign money in Germany by sending Diomach's revenue to its Swiss branch, labeling them as royalty payments. while also leaving Diamant's leader, Willy Haidinger, with a 10% ownership stake to keep up appearances that a German was still in charge of the company. These simple tricks helped IBM completely cover its tracks when moving money outside of Germany, because according to public record, there was almost no evidence of American ownership with Diamant. In 1937, Watson arrived again in Berlin, Germany, this time for a meeting of the International Chamber of Commerce, a predecessor to the United Nations with a focus on global business. And this was a special night for Thomas J. Watson. He was the guest of honor for the event, being appointed president of this elite committee, a group that also included Adolf Hitler. And at an after-party celebrating Watson's appointment, where the American CEO could be found rubbing shoulders with many top Nazi officials, Thomas Watson was then welcomed personally by Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, where the Nazi leader draped a medal around Watson's neck. This was the Order of the German Eagle Medal, a medal of honor from the Nazis featuring a white cross joined by swastikas and eagles specifically approved by Hitler himself to be reserved for only his closest foreign allies. And after this International Chamber of Commerce meeting took place, Watson went to Italy to meet with fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. And shortly after that, he would also go on to partner with Japan to help organize the construction of their world-class Air Force, the very same one that attacked Pearl Harbor in the United States less than 5 years later. This also meant that Thomas Watson was now doing business with all three countries that made up the Axis powers, while the rest of the world, including his own country, were gearing up to fight a war against them. And at this point, during the mid and late 1930s, Hitler's actions were becoming impossible to justify for the rest of the world. In November 1938, on a night that would later be known as Kristallnacht, tens of thousands of Jewish people were arrested, with thousands of Jewish-owned shops being broken into and synagogues being destroyed across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. It was a warning shot of what was to come in the next few years. Brutal, sudden, and brazen violence carried out by the Nazis against their Jewish people. Europe was terrified about what the Nazis would do next. But for Watson, Kristallnacht was an opportunity, because IBM had been struggling to negotiate with about 24 governments around Europe. And when Kristallnacht happened, everything changed. All of a sudden, IBM was given insider access to top secret military projects all around Europe. The continent was preparing for war, and it needed Watson's tabulating machines to manage its inventory, soldiers, tanks, planes, and everything else a military would use to survive. But at this point, global public opinion had completely turned against the Nazis as countless countries started to pull ambassadors out of Germany, with all of this tension escalating to a point of no return when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. Leaving no doubt that his Nazi army wanted to destroy everything in its path in order to achieve world domination. France and the UK immediately responded by declaring war, while any newspapers, governments, or businesses associated with the Nazis came under attack. The international boycott causing German imports to the US to drop by 25%. But Thomas Watson and IBM had almost flown completely under the radar from this scrutiny. His complicated network of shell companies set up across Europe was working just as Watson intended. The perfect way to disguise who he was actually partnering with. And Watson's connections within the US government made sure that IBM didn't enter the spotlight of America's anger. So in public, Thomas Watson urged the world to try to find universal peace by working together, giving a speech to tens of thousands of people at the World's Fair in 1940, asking his listeners to achieve peace through world trade. But as he was pleading for unity around the world, Thomas Watson gave his personal approval that would force IBM's French subsidiary to collaborate with the Germans after the Nazis had invaded France and took over its north and west regions. And even though this two-faced request by Thomas Watson was clearly an example of him playing both sides of the war, it paid off for his company, because IBM's French division quadrupled in profits between 1940 and 1942 while being occupied and controlled by the Nazis. And back in Germany, Diamog's profits had also doubled from the previous year, making their stock worth around 230 million Reichsmarks, which would make Diamog's value over $1 billion today. A massive jump from the $104,000 investment that Watson had made to acquire a 90% stake just a few years prior. Because his deal, supplying the devil with punch cards, was already making him a fortune. And all across Europe, IBM's Hollerith machines were in demand like never before as the Nazis conquered more and more of the Allies' territories, which on the surface looks like simple war profiteering. But in reality, the dark truth behind this surge in demand was an undeniable evil. And underneath the piles of orders and mountains of cash, IBM's punch card machines were being put to use for the most horrifying part of the Nazi program, their concentration camps, with Thomas Watson and his network making sure that all of these death operations ran smoothly. And when Hitler was looking for a final solution to rid himself and Germany of its Jewish population, he came up with a horrifying plan to mass murder millions of innocent men, women, and children. A plan that would only work if he had the help of IBM's punch card machines. As the Nazis marched over borders and took control of countries across Europe, they carried out the same methodical steps when documenting newly conquered populations, organizing, deporting, and even executing prisoners based on statistics. And these cold calculating systems were all managed through IBM's death devices. Jewish people across Eastern Europe were being segregated into ghettos, forcing them into lockdown areas that were strictly patrolled by Nazi officers, where they were ordered to work and deprived of basic necessities. After the Nazis moved into a new conquered city, they would quickly move in their punch card devices and run a census on the people that remained. These reports on IBM punch cards would determine the amount of food needed, the number of laborers available, and how much of their military would be required to control each area. For example, after the Nazis conquered Warsaw, Poland, the entire city's population was forced to fill out a census form in person, with each person having their fingerprint taken and given an ID document, with anyone moving around the city without an ID being deported or executed on the spot. Within 2 days, all of the forms within Warsaw had been processed, with the Nazi leadership quickly finding out there were nearly 360,000 Jewish people within the city. And this speed and efficiency demonstrated by the Nazis was only possible due to the punch card machines made by Diamog in Berlin, Germany, and supported by IBM back at HQ. As the Nazis continued to occupy more territories across Eastern Europe, each one of their census reports calculated the number of Jewish men, women, and children that they needed to deport or imprison. While back in Berlin, the Diamog factory was churning out millions of punch cards a day for Hitler's expanding empire. By the end of World War II, the Nazis would use over 9 billion punch cards to track and categorize each of their Nazi prisoners. And whenever the Nazis took over another country, the IBM subsidiary residing in that territory was now taken over by Diamog, where it was quickly rebranded so it could continue the same exact work as the other Nazi facilities, using the sly payment strategy to get all of the profits directly into Thomas Watson's dirty hands. And at this point, a significant portion of IBM's revenue was now coming from its international operations. So Thomas Watson was reportedly micromanaging all of his subsidiaries across Europe, with each machine's revenue being closely tracked by Watson's team of accountants back at IBM's headquarters in New York. Even after some of the US allies declared war against Germany, Thomas Watson initially wasn't worried about being pushed out of Diamog, or even Europe for that matter. He knew the Nazis recognized how important Diamog was for their regime, as they depended on IBM's network of machinery, punch cards, and engineers to keep its empire functioning. With the Nazis' railroads, soldiers, equipment, and their concentration camps all being accounted for by IBM patented technology, Thomas Watson was more than happy to look the other way at whatever the Nazis were doing with his machines, as long as IBM was getting paid. But everything changed on December 7th, 1941. When the United States came under attack.
Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
177 Japanese planes dropped bombs on the US battleship filled with naval soldiers. This was the same exact Japanese Air Force that IBM had helped develop with its technology only a few years prior. Over 2,400 Americans were killed in this surprise attack, pulling the US into World War II against Japan, and ultimately the rest of the Axis powers, which were led by Italy and Nazi Germany. This declaration of war caused the American government to immediately put a strict ban on all trade with Germany, requiring that any company that wanted to do business with the Nazis had to get a license and approval from US's top leadership. But for Watson, there was always a way around the rules. And this new trade restriction didn't apply to neutral Switzerland, where IBM's European operations were run out of. So Watson took advantage of this loophole by keeping very close communication between IBM's headquarters in New York and its European operations in Geneva, Switzerland. And as the battles raged on, IBM branches around Europe couldn't keep up with all their demand from their customers, meaning there was a wait list for new punch card machines as long as 2 years out. Then, in 1942, the Nazis approved the final solution, which was the horrifying climax to Adolf Hitler's core beliefs, where he would rid the world of the Jews once and for all, a message he had been preaching since publishing his book of hate as a young man. So when all the calculations were completed by the Nazi Statistics Office, helped by experts from DIMOC, they had discovered there were over 11 million Jews in Europe. But after Hitler gave the order for the final solution, they were all sentenced to death. And this terrifying plan depended on the efficiency of two key programs: the Nazi train transportation system and their concentration camps, both of which were controlled and organized by IBM's Hollerith devices. With punch card machines being placed at nearly every concentration camp and train station, all calculating the data for Nazi camp leaders to make their cruel decisions, which started from the second that these innocent prisoners arrived at their deadly destination, with all of the personal details from each Jewish captive being punched onto a DIMOC branded card, which created a 5-digit number for every man, woman, and child being forced into these horrific prison camps. The numbers were then tattooed onto each prisoner's forearm, a permanent stamp of their horrifying experience.
Sie wissen nicht, wie sie heißen. Sie kennen ihre Familie nicht. Nur Nummern haben sie eingebrannt. Ein Brandmal auf Kinderärmchen.
This cold, methodical process was the same across the countless Nazi concentration camps located all around Europe. And when there weren't enough prisoners in the camps to do their slave labor, the Nazis simply rounded up more Jews from the ghettos. But if these same camps started to overflow with too many slaves, then it was IBM's punch card system data that would decide which innocent prisoners would be brutally exterminated in gas chambers. The Nazis even had a special designation on their custom DIMOC punch cards to identify prisoners who were executed in this manner, labeling these cards with the haunting words "special treatment" to indicate a gas chamber execution. And as the final solution continued to rage on, these concentration camps were converted into full factories of death, where vulnerable men, women, and children were pulled out of their makeshift homes and forced onto trains that they would never return from, with entire groups of naive passengers often being sent straight into the gas chamber for mass execution within moments of them arriving, as Nazi soldiers rushed to clear space for the next group of unsuspecting Jewish prisoners that needed to also be exterminated. And while it is clear that IBM did not put these innocent people to death themselves, there is no way the Nazis would have been able to slaughter nearly as many Jews during the final solution had it not been for Germany's ruthless efficiency and planning, all thanks to the use of death machines that they received from IBM and Diamant. So after the war, people around the world demanded justice for the massacres that they uncovered. And governments spanning from the United States all the way to Soviet Russia started making promises to their citizens that they would vow to punish all Nazi war criminals for their terrifying actions, including anyone caught working with them. And one would think that the people who rented their technology to the Nazis, the same equipment that was a central part of the plan, responsible for murdering 6 million innocent people, would be at the top of their list. But IBM wasn't even on the American government's radar, because Thomas Watson had been playing both sides the entire time, helping to secretly develop some of the most important technology for the American government. At the same exact time, he was supplying the Nazis with their death machines. And his relationship with the US government was about to pay off in a way that not even Thomas himself could ever imagine. On April 30th, 1945, hunkered down in a bunker underneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler saw no way out. His empire had crumbled all around him, and his ideology had been torn apart. He knew that he had lost the war and that the Allied forces were closing in on him. So he decided to end it all. So after 6 long, devastating years of bloodshed and 70 million deaths, World War II officially ended 18 weeks later on September 2nd, 1945. News quickly spread around the world, and in Sydney, Australia, one American lieutenant colonel ran on the streets to celebrate. His name was Thomas Watson Jr., the son of IBM's commander-in-chief. And Tom Jr. was preparing to return to New York and take over his father's empire. A graduate of American Ivy League school Brown University, Tom Jr. did a short stint as an IBM salesman, whereas son of the boss, he found success easily. But when the war broke out, Tom Jr. nobly stepped up and served for the US Air Force. And while he had seen firsthand when his father was awarded the Medal of Honor from the Nazis, he felt compelled to join the cause against them as a proud American fighting for what he believed was right. But Tom Jr. never fought a battle in the US Air Force during World War II. No, he was a Watson, a widely known last name in US military circles. So while other men his age were battling for their lives across cities in Europe and North Africa, Tom Jr. was kept far out of reach of harm's way, working as a promoter for a flight simulation program while traveling around the US and Australia. And as soon as the war ended, the position of vice president was ready and waiting for him at IBM when he arrived back home, where business was booming at IBM, far greater than Tom Jr. had ever remembered. All because his father had been playing both sides of the war, while he had been naively serving in uniform for the United States. But when Tom Jr. got around to questioning Thomas Sr. about IBM's relationship with the Nazis, Watson claimed that he had cut all ties with the Germans well before World War II even began, shortly after mailing his Nazi medal back to Hitler in 1940. But unknown to Tom Jr. and most of the world, Thomas J. Watson was still receiving direct communications from Diamant's German leaders, both during and after the war, via IBM's European operations in neutral Switzerland, with one critical letter being sent directly to Thomas Watson from a German IBM manager in the weeks following the Nazis' surrender, assuring Watson that all interests of IBM were in good hands, including German funds hidden in accounts out of the Czech Republic, a fact that didn't come to light until over 50 years later. So even though things were getting back to normal for the Watson family in New York, pretty much every major city in Europe had been left completely shattered from the war. But Thomas Watson didn't care about any of that. He only had one thing on his mind: how he could save IBM's dirty money and death machines from being lost in the spoils of war. But this is where Watson's powerful connections really came through for him. Being one of the most powerful elites in the entire country, Thomas Watson knew he was just a phone call away from US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. So while wealthy German business people and European bankers were being sent to prison for their acts committed during World War II, thanks to the Nuremberg trials, IBM's equipment that was previously being used by the Nazis was either being quietly returned to them or kept functioning in Germany after the war. All of Diamant's equipment was included in a confidential civil affairs guide to preserve record keeping, with US Special Forces units being deployed to track down Watson's punch card machines. But not many of the soldiers had a problem with this either. You see, many of these men were IBM employees, or they had at least been trained by the company at one time. And Thomas Watson promised all company staff serving in the war that they would still receive 25% of their salaries while deployed overseas. And this action taught Thomas Watson their loyalty. Ironic, though, that the man who was helping the Nazis manage and execute the Holocaust was the same person paying US soldiers additional money to help stop them. Knowing he was playing a dangerous game by being partnered with the Nazis through his complex web of European operations, Thomas Watson took great care to keep his solid reputation within America. As soon as the US had entered the war, he made sure his support was extremely public, offering full use of IBM factories and equipment to the US military. But beyond Watson's public patriotic duties, there was a much deeper, secret relationship between the US government and IBM. One that would lift the company into an entirely new business segment that also helped sweep Thomas Watson's evil deeds right under the rug. You see, IBM was working with the US military on almost 100 separate research projects, ranging from radio equipment to aircraft manufacturing. And in the final years of World War II, Watson approved a controversial project to fund a radical idea from a Harvard physicist. And what emerged was the Mark I, a 5-ton machine fitted with over 500 miles of electric wiring connecting its 3 million circuits, which moved around a system of giant gears and switches to help calculate the answers for some of the most complex math equations on Earth. For the scientific community, this would mean a greater development in academic research. And for the US government, it gave them a tool to develop the most advanced military weapons the world has ever seen. But Thomas Watson wasn't focused on the scientific or technology advancements. He just wanted all the credit for this new device that his team created. So when a newspaper article basically ignored IBM's contributions to the project while giving all the praise to the Harvard physicist in charge, Watson was furious. He ordered his IBM engineers to come up with a new device even more powerful than the Mark I in order to get the recognition that Thomas Watson felt he was entitled to and deserved. But that would have to wait, because competitors were actually threatening IBM for the first time in its history. In 1951, a machine created by a company named Univac fired the first shot by becoming the world's first general-purpose digital computer, which meant IBM was quickly falling behind. And for the first time, Thomas Watson could see that his tech kingdom might be in jeopardy. But before he could focus on reclaiming IBM's lead in the computing market, Thomas Watson found himself facing yet another threat, this time from the US Department of Justice, who had accused IBM of turning its punch card machines into a monopoly. But just like during the rest of his career, Thomas Watson refused to admit that he had done anything wrong. And at the age of 78, he knew his days were numbered. Tom Jr., who was next in line to run IBM, was constantly fighting with his father, who refused to stop meddling or even provide the company with a proper succession plan. So when Tom Jr. finally lost patience and blew up, yelling at his father one day, Thomas J. Watson finally surrendered IBM to his son, throwing his hands up and telling him to take the reins of the company while he abruptly left for unrelated business trip. But Tom Jr. had been paying attention all of those years, watching his father closely, and he was able to keep IBM afloat, riding the wave of computing advancements that his father had stumbled upon during his secret projects with the US military, creating next-gen computers known as mainframes that were large enough to fill an entire room and were focused on handling large amounts of data and completing complex calculations quickly. Every company in the world, from industries like banking, retail, manufacturing, and many others, were all rapidly buying up IBM mainframe computers. But none of these advancements mattered to Thomas Watson, because in May of 1956, his body was failing him quickly. So it was at that time that he officially handed over his most prized possession to his son, making Tom Jr. just the company's second CEO in more than 40 years. But Thomas Sr. had built up a lot of bad habits in his 50-plus years of doing business, with one of these traits being stubbornness, which eventually caused his final undoing. So then, less than a month after handing over his company, Watson died at the age of 82. Thomas J. Watson was a man who seemed determined to leave his mark on history. But his legacy will forever be stained in blood. His machines had been used to systematically murder millions of people. And his close active partnership with the Nazis fueled Watson's business empire. He should have faced justice for his actions, but he was too big and too important to fail, which got him help from some high-up members within the US government when needing to cover his tracks. But there were others that wouldn't forget the evil deeds committed by Thomas J. Watson, and they would be coming for the thing that he cared about most. Thomas Watson had gotten away with his deal with the devil, or so he thought, because despite his powerful connections, Watson's partnership with the Nazis created dangerous enemies who would spend decades hunting what he treasured most. And the first one of these hunters had a badge and unlimited resources. In 1940, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover launched an investigation into IBM's Nazi connections. He knew IBM had deep German ties, and he wanted to check to see if there were any Nazi spies within the company. Hoover ordered interviews with many of the top-ranking officials at IBM, including executives, managers, directors, and even some IBM clients were questioned as well. Thomas Watson Sr. told the FBI that he would do anything the agency needed to help with their investigation. But even after meeting with one of the lead inspectors, Watson didn't mention a man named Carl George Ruth, who was a big red flag for the FBI. Not only was Ruth born in Germany and known to be a pro-Nazi supporter, but his performance at IBM had reportedly been terrible. It seemed impossible that a man as incompetent as this would slip through the cracks and still keep his job. But that's because there was a secret reason that Thomas Watson kept this underperformer at his company. You see, Carl George Ruth was married to Watson's niece. So after realizing that this was a simple case of nepotism and not hidden Nazi spies, the FBI investigation eventually trailed off without any charges. But it still showed that there were some people within the US government who weren't going to look the other way when it came to Thomas Watson's unforgivable deeds alongside the Nazis, and they were determined to bring him to justice. Another one of these government officials was named Harold J. Carter, who worked in the economic warfare section. He knew that the relationship between IBM and the Nazis was much closer than many people realized. Interviewing some of the key people involved, like the general manager for IBM Europe, J.W. Shatu. And Shatu admitted to him that the records for the 1933 census had been completely destroyed, informing Carter that Watson's European business was mainly done in person, specifically so there wouldn't be any records. But there was something preventing his department from pursuing this investigation any further, because IBM had been vital to the United States during World War II at the same exact time as it was helping the Nazis. Thomas Watson was business royalty, and he had his tentacles in all parts of the government. Carter started to realize that his investigation was destined to fail and slowly abandoned his pursuit. This led Thomas Watson Sr. to be let completely off the hook, passing away peacefully without ever being held accountable for his treason or the crimes he committed against humanity. But 13 years after his death, the Department of Justice attacked IBM again, and this time it would be an all-out war. Except the laws IBM was being accused of breaking didn't have anything to do with partnering with the Nazis. Instead, under Tom Jr.'s leadership, IBM was accused of using shady business tactics in order to keep competition out through manipulation. And what is most ironic about this is that it is the exact same federal law that Tom Jr.'s father, Thomas J. Watson, had been accused of breaking early at his first company, NCR, back in 1912. The US Justice Department claimed that IBM had given away software for free in order to tie in customers to its mainframe hardware. But this trial was really about IBM's complete dominance over the entire computing market. By the mid-1960s, mainframe computers made up 87% of the total computer systems running in the United States, and IBM was responsible for 4 out of every 5 of these devices. Tom Jr. had overseen an explosion in growth where IBM had tripled in size, becoming America's biggest tech company with over 100,000 employees. The key to their success came from the same rental model that Herman Hollerith established in the late 1800s and Watson later used to supply punch card machines to the Nazis through Diamant. But Tom Jr. took things a step further than his predecessors, pumping $5 billion into creating the first ever computer operating system for a wide range of devices, from mainframe computers to small storage and plug-in devices. He called it System 360, and it brought an entire line of computers under one unifying architecture, with the software and hardware compatible across devices. Very similar to the concept that Apple introduced a few decades later. Once customers bought a number of IBM products, they were then locked into a tightly closed ecosystem that Tom Jr. had masterminded. And this strategy worked like a charm. Within 3 years after System 360's release, IBM's revenue had more than doubled yet again. The US government's lawsuit claimed that these tactics were completely illegal. They claimed IBM was using predatory pricing and fusing hardware with software just to keep competitors from breaking into the market. The US Justice Department wanted IBM torn apart and separated into smaller businesses. It was one of 9 private lawsuits actively being fought by IBM, all claiming that they were playing dirty, underhanded tricks in order to manipulate the market. And over the next decade, nearly 900 witnesses testified across both sides, with almost 30 million documents being generated. But after all that was said and done, the case was finally dismissed in January of 1982. And while IBM may have been found innocent, the case had been painful and destroyed their astronomical growth. Not only had the legal battle proved to be very lengthy, but it was taking up precious time for many of IBM's key executives who were dragged into court to testify. The US government may not have won their lawsuit against IBM, but they certainly succeeded in getting their revenge. Because the biggest reason that their lawsuit was dropped was because IBM no longer had a monopoly in the computer industry. So for some in the government, all that time and money was worth it. It was the only way to get revenge on IBM and Thomas J. Watson's legacy. And now, with IBM depleted and vulnerable, it was in desperate need of a new market to profit off of. But the stress of all these battles had been too much for Tom Jr. to handle, who suffered from a heart attack during the trial and quietly resigned as CEO of IBM. And just like that, the Watson name was wiped out of elite business circles that they had dominated for nearly 90 years. But the DNA of IBM lived on, leading to decades more of horrible crimes continuing to this very day. But eventually, karma would be served after IBM made one of the biggest blunders in business history, costing them tens of billions of dollars in the process. And it was at this moment that IBM's true colors came out, with the company turning against the people who were keeping it afloat, its employees, creating a campaign of harassment, theft, and even causing more death. After finishing from their long, drawn-out lawsuit against the US government, the 1980s got off to a tense but exciting start for IBM. With competitors like Apple starting to make a name for themselves, IBM was forced to enter into the growing personal computer market. It needed to rush its production before falling further behind. And for the first time, IBM branched outside of its own technology. It would put together an Intel microprocessor with an operating system owned by a young entrepreneur.
And we'll start with 28-year-old William H. Gates III, who was a teenager, co-founded Microsoft Corporation, now the world's foremost producer of computer software.
A man named Bill Gates, who at the time was a simple co-founder of an ambitious startup company named Microsoft. IBM sent Microsoft $75,000 to buy an operating system called QDDoS and then reconfigure it. A decision that would come back to haunt them, costing them tens of billions of dollars in the process. But at the time, they were none the wiser to this critical mistake. And in 1981, IBM released its 5150 series, also known as the IBM PC, and it was a hit, instantly making the DOS operating system an industry standard. The 5150 brought in $1 billion in revenue in just its first year alone, with 2.4 million units being sold the second year, and by the third year, IBM controlled 75% of the personal computing market, with IBM seeing its company revenue grow to a massive $46 billion a year, making them the most valuable company on Earth. But IBM's time at the top didn't last long. Its next line of computers, like the IBM PC Junior, were complete failures. And as a final nail in the coffin, the computer engineer who had been the mastermind behind IBM's success with its PCs tragically died in a plane crash in 1985. It was the symbolic death of IBM's PC division, which never recovered. But even more difficult for IBM was that they accidentally created a fierce rival. Because that $75,000 they first paid to Bill Gates for the QDOS system was now worth $27 billion a decade and a half later, making Microsoft one of the biggest companies in the world, even larger than IBM. All because of IBM's critical mistake of not getting exclusive rights to the operating system that Microsoft then sold to all of its competitors. And year by year, things kept getting worse. Some of IBM's best employees were being forced to leave the company as part of cost-cutting measures. And after fumbling the PC market to competitors, IBM's leadership retreated back into making mini-computers and mainframes as they tried to clutch on to what remained of their historic past. However, there were a few brief highlights here and there, one of which was when IBM's supercomputer, Deep Blue, beat the reigning world chess champion in 1997, making it the first computer to do so. And then again, more than a decade later, when IBM's artificial intelligence program, ironically named IBM Watson, won the game Jeopardy against world-renowned champions like Ken Jennings.
Watson?
Who is Mario Cuomo?
Correct.
Let's finish MC5.
A classic by Crockett Johnson, Harold and the Blank Crayon. Watson.
What is purple?
Correct.
But after that, the IBM Watson program took a disastrous turn. Their downward spiral all started when they decided to focus on the healthcare industry. IBM's leadership believed that this would be a revolutionary step in healthcare by allowing their AI software to make rapid disease diagnosis and treatment recommendations. This would allow patients to be treated much faster than from human analysis. That was in theory, but in reality, Watson AI was practically unusable. The program wrongly diagnosed patients and even gave dangerous recommendations. In one case, it recommended a drug that could cause a fatal hemorrhage to a patient that was already suffering from internal bleeding. Eventually, IBM closed down its Watson Health AI division and sold it for parts. This was just another costly mistake in IBM's rapidly growing list of painful errors. Having already lost the PC battle against Apple, HP, and Dell, the operating system war to Microsoft, and the fight over business databases against Oracle, all competitors that IBM should have dominated had the company been running properly because it had a massive lead in each of those three markets. But the company seems to not be able to get out of its own way because once again, after being an initial leader in the race for artificial intelligence, IBM's strategy was falling apart as well, because the company was more dysfunctional than ever, ripping itself apart from the inside out. Between 1980 and 2000, it lost over 200,000 of its employees. Entire office buildings were left virtually abandoned. But some naive employees still held out hope even through all the evidence clearly showing that IBM was falling apart. Because Thomas Watson had always claimed that the company was one big family and took care of its own, which is why he never believed in unions when Watson could just give generous benefits and higher salaries all powered by its growing global empire. But now it was the 1980s, and it was a new IBM. Long gone were the days of the Hollerith machine and IBM's mainframes that brought them to glory originally. Instead, people were being fired by the thousands with no cause, which made some workers want to fight back.
3 former employees are suing IBM for age discrimination. The lawsuit comes months after a report from ProPublica claimed IBM had dismissed more than 20,000 workers over 40 years old in the last 5 years.
IBM responded aggressively. The activists calling out for more rights were being threatened with intimidating letters from IBM lawyers with the sole intention of scaring away people from organizing against them. This conflict came to a head in 1999 when IBM made a radical change to its pension plan. Because up until then, they had been paying a traditional pension to their employees, which built up over the workers' years of service. Essentially, the longer an IBM employee worked, the more they would be paid each year of their retirement. But in 1999, that all changed when IBM moved on to something called a cash balance plan. This new plan didn't take into account how many years an employee had been in service of the company. Instead, it provided a percentage of the worker's salary straight into an account, along with some interest. IBM advertised this strategy to its employees as more modern, easier to understand, and flexible that would all help them in retirement. In reality, it was a huge blow to its most loyal employees. Engineers and operation managers who had been at the company for decades were now only earning the same level of retirement as their colleagues that were 20 and 30 years younger than them. For some, this meant that the amount that they could expect in their retirement pensions was now cut by over 50%, instantly destroying their strategy for their retirement. But for IBM executives, it was a simple decision, a way to save the company $200 million. But in doing so, they were stealing directly out of their employees' hands. Lives were being shattered, with one man deciding to end things after giving 15 years of loyal service to the company, only to be abruptly laid off without any reason. This policy change was a massive scandal, both inside and outside of IBM, with one of IBM's engineers agreeing to testify to the Senate, telling the public that IBM had broken a bond of trust with its employees.
Congratulate our fellow Vermonters who have stood up in Essex Junction, Vermont, and have said to IBM that it is not acceptable for them to renege on a promise that they made to tens and tens of thousands of workers and to change the name of the game midstream and cut back pension benefits by 30, 40, and in some cases, 50%.
Eventually, IBM backed down. Well, sort of. They announced that 35,000 of their workers would be allowed to stay on their old, more beneficial pension plan, which included all workers over 40 years old. But this show of goodwill was too little, too late. 130,000 of its employees had joined a class action lawsuit against the company, claiming that it was unfairly impacting older workers. Before the bad press and payout was required to be any higher, IBM stopped the bleeding and put an end to the lawsuit, agreeing to pay $320 million to those employees. Since then, many other workers have tried filing lawsuits against the company, but IBM has used its many financial resources to block, delay, or throw out these lawsuits due to technicalities. Anyone standing up to the company was attacked viciously in the courtroom, even over clear signs of racism. In 2018, an African-American IBM salesman, Jerome Beard, filed a lawsuit against the company. He had closed 2 deals worth over $25 million to IBM. But when he asked for the commission that he was promised, Jerome was only given 15% out of the over $2 million commission paycheck that he was entitled to. Meanwhile, his white colleagues received their full share of commission payments. When another salesman stood up for Jerome and called it racial discrimination, he was fired in retaliation. And despite IBM's best efforts, a jury agreed with Jerome that this was a wrongful termination, ordering IBM to pay $11 million. The once tech leader was losing money everywhere. It couldn't stop the bleeding as it kept missing opportunities and hurting itself with lawsuits while scaring away its best employees. And in the 2000s, this got even worse, as IBM started to abandon its American employees altogether, moving many of its business operations overseas. This once American icon was left with a reputation of discrimination, bullying, and racism. The culture of loyalty that Thomas J. Watson had spent decades building was dead and buried. The IBM family was a broken home. Its culture had turned on its most valuable resource, its employees. But what do you expect from a family that was built on the profits of war and genocide? And over the years, there was one thing consistent with this company. It had been helping foreign governments with surveillance and unethical tracking. Even after all this time, IBM still hadn't learned its lesson from working with the Nazis. Because to this very day, IBM is still assisting the most dangerous and oppressive governments on terrorizing its citizens. While IBM is not the tech powerhouse it once was in the 1950s and 60s, they still hover around the 60th largest company in the world. And like a cockroach, IBM just won't seem to die. But the company has seen a bit of a renaissance back to its glory days after making one of the largest acquisitions in tech history back in 2019, where it spent $34 billion on the open source technology company Red Hat. Which is ironic because Red Hat's core technology philosophy is about being open and available to anyone to use it for free. The complete opposite ideology of IBM founders like Herman Hollerith and Thomas J. Watson. But what hasn't gone from IBM's core ideology is its 100-year-long expertise in providing technology and services to governments aiming to monitor, suppress, and even eliminate specific groups within their populations. Because even today, anywhere a government is oppressing people's rights, IBM is not far away. During the 1970s, during the apartheid system of South Africa, which segregated black people, excluding them from society, it was IBM technology which enabled this racist practice to become a reality. And it did so by categorizing South African people into tiers, with white people being labeled at the top of the pyramid, while people of color being regulated to the bottom, with different housing, services, and public spaces being assigned to each race, along with making interracial marriage illegal. Over 80% of South Africa's land was reserved for its white population, with anyone else needing special documentation in order just to be there. In South Africa, during apartheid, a person's appearance and public perception was a way to determine someone's race and therefore value. Not a far stretch from the Aryan master race ideology that the Nazis believed in and IBM helped support. The South African government just needed a database to record all of this information on its citizens. So IBM sold them the tools that they needed to run this racist national identity system. IBM computers like the Model 370 were used as part of South Africa's computerized population register or passbook system that they used to compile data points like name, gender, residence, as well as photograph and fingerprints. Sounds familiar, right? Even inside IBM, there were voices speaking out against this collaboration. A group called IBM Black Worker Alliance criticized the company for its support of apartheid South Africa. A member of this alliance even testified for the US government that IBM officials had harassed and threatened the organization's members for their activism. And after filing a complaint, he was unjustly fired. Ultimately, IBM agreed to settle with this activist to keep things from getting further out into the public. And although IBM did eventually join other major corporations from around the world in calling for an end to apartheid and racial discrimination across South Africa, their actions were not matching their words. Because much like Thomas Watson's commitments and speeches for peace during World War II, the support from IBM to help stop apartheid was mainly for public perception. Because IBM only withdrew from working with South African officials in 1987. A full year after the US banned trade with the South African government. And at the same time that IBM had been instilling racism and hate within South Africa, it had been poking the bear of the Soviet Union. Because IBM's relationship with the Soviet Union went back decades. Back in 1959, during the tense standoff of the Cold War between capitalist America and communist Russia, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was invited by Tom Jr. to visit IBM campuses in San Jose, California, where Khrushchev was given a VIP tour of the premises, shown the latest designs, and had all his technical questions answered, which was uncomfortable for many leaders around the US at the time due to the fact that the United States had already put a trade embargo and restrictions against the Soviet Union as far as 9 years earlier as part of the Korean War. And one of the main concerns for many US government officials was that the Soviets would create superior technology and in particular weapons at this critical moment in history. Remember, this was the era of the space race to the moon, high-speed aircraft, and supercomputers. But it went deeper than that. Behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union, there was a brutal system of concentration camps, very similar to Nazi Germany. Arrests were being made to inspire terror and disorientation. Stepping a foot out of line was meant being sent to one of these isolated labor camps known as gulags, with most prisoners being slowly killed through soul-crushing hunger and extreme exhaustion from the continuous backbreaking work that they were forced to do day in and day out. A place where beatings, humiliation, and torture were common practice, and you could be put to death for even the most minor mistake. 1.6 million people, primarily made up of political opponents, minorities, and war prisoners, were forced to live in these gulags. In 1957, just a couple of years before visiting IBM, Nikita Khrushchev announced he was shutting down the gulags. But in reality, the system didn't end for another 30 years. Meanwhile, IBM was accused again and again of doing business with the Soviet Union, despite the trade ban from the US government and the horrific crimes going on. In 1970, a group of IBM executives, including Tom Jr., flew into the Soviet Union, but refused to tell the media why they had gone for the visit. At the time, it was reported that IBM was eager to sell its computers to the Soviet government. And that same year, the Soviets released a 5-year economic plan that prioritized developing their computing industry. They would soon be relying on IBM's products and making their own computers compatible with IBM's ecosystem. In 1989, the Moscow Institute of Thermal Technology somehow got its hands on around 100 of these IBM computers. Then, in 1996, IBM was fined over $8 million for selling their technology to a Russian nuclear weapons lab. This was completely against US law, considering their trade partner. Another prime example of IBM committing treason. The company's willingness to support a horrifying apartheid system and then invest in America's biggest enemy for nearly half a century continues to prove the point that IBM will serve any customer that is willing to pay it money to this day, no matter how cruel or oppressive their customers' goals are. And case in point, in January of 2024, IBM opened a regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia.
We have decided to open a software development lab where we are going to be harnessing the talent of the local population. We are going to build AI-based technologies here that we are then going to take into our global market. I think that is incredibly exciting.
A country it has operated in since 1974, stating publicly that it is helping the Saudi government use its technology to strengthen its economy and cyber defenses. However, in reality, many people believe that means increasing its surveillance on its own citizens, taking active steps to closely watch and repress the rights of its female population, in particular within online sexual harassment cases. And while intimidation and repression of political dissidents has been a constant theme within Saudi Arabia's history, the Saudi royal crown decided to significantly increase that intensity back in 2018 after their brazen murder of a Washington Post journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. The justified backlash and rebellion from this incident from many of Saudi's citizens was met with immediate decisive action from the Saudi government by identifying opposing voices online, installing spyware in their devices, and arresting these activists.
Maybe they were listening to every single call that we had. They were listening, they were reading our chat. Every single minute, so many people are contacting me via my Instagram, my Snapchat, my Twitter account. So now they are in the real danger because of that.
And not far away in China, it's a similar story. because IBM has been building specialized microprocessors to help the Chinese government track its citizens' every move, with one device being small enough to be packed into a car that can collect the activity of almost any cell phone in the area. And in doing so, IBM has seemingly ignored America's escalating trade and information war with China, instead deciding to assist in the creation of their state-of-the-art new surveillance system called INEX. The capabilities of this system are truly terrifying.
These cameras are looking at a road junction, and they're identifying everything that's passing through. They're looking at cars, reading the number plates, and they're looking at pedestrians, classifying pedestrians according to their age, their gender, what kind of clothes they're wearing, even what kind of hairstyles they have.
Giving Chinese government officials access to virtually unlimited data from tap phone lines and internet communications of hundreds of millions of people. When asked about whether IBM would withdraw from places where human rights were being abused, IBM's current CEO, Arvind Krishna, said the company would abide by the principles of the countries that they would operate in and what is considered correct behavior there. With a bloody track record of aiding genocide and oppression that spans nearly 100 years, IBM should know by now that the principles of some countries aren't always ethical. But the most evil tech company in the world has proven time and time again that it's perfectly fine with its technology being used for the purest evil on earth as long as it's making the company profits. Because in the core of IBM's rotten DNA is a heartless evil that will never remove the stain of blood from the 6 million lives it helped destroy. And if you thought Thomas Watson was a cold calculating CEO who would do anything to win no matter the cost, then you need to check out this video here on the dark secret behind the world's youngest billionaire to see just how far someone will go in order to get filthy rich in today's day and age.